Thematically, the Sunbreaker Titan is my favorite of the three subclasses. Tossing explosive hammers at my enemies gives a visceral feeling of power. The fundamental idea is really fun. In practice though, things are less than stellar. Let's talk about why. In order to best discuss the Sunbreaker Titan, first I feel it's important for us to go over the basics of what the Striker Titan is capable of, as it is the most important competition for this subclass. If you're a Titan main, then you already know that Striker is far and away the best Titan subclass for PvE, and is plenty good in PvP as well. Striker can hold 2 of the best grenades in the game, while other subclasses are only able to hold 1, and it's oftentimes worse. When using Striker, your melee ability will recharge those grenades, making your effective potential for damage astronomical. Each slam of your super leaves behind an AoE that pulses for pretty decent damage, effectively a miniature pulse grenade. With how wide each slam's AoE is, clearing even really strong adds and raids is not a difficult task, and it generates a lot of orbs for the rest of your team. Its subclass exotic, the Insurmountable Skullfort, is also incredibly powerful, and quite frankly the only thing you should be wearing in most situations. Basically, the Striker subclass offers a lot of value at all times against all enemies with the exception of raid bosses, and what it loses in its ability to use the super on a raid boss, it gains in having double pulse grenades to mash into a raid boss, and fantastic orb generation for the rest of the fire team so they can use their supers on the boss instead. So if you're planning on playing any other subclass in high-level content like the Sunbreaker Titan, well, it's got quite a lot to live up to. There's actually a lot of potential for this subclass to compete with Striker in terms of damage output and crowd control. Thermite grenades have massive damage output, but unfortunately only affect targets in a straight line. Luckily for the Sunbreaker Titan, there is actually great potential to compete with Striker in terms of damage output and crowd control. Thermite grenades have massive damage output, but unfortunately only affect targets in a straight line. This line's direction is always 180 degrees from whichever direction the grenade last moved before stopping. For example, if you throw the grenade straight ahead at a flat surface, it'll shoot the line in front of you as you would hope. However, if you bounce the grenade in a weird way, or it hits an enemy and goes wild, the lines of thermite will go in whatever direction they please, 9 times out of 10 hitting no targets for any damage whatsoever, so make sure you're aiming for the ground in front of your target whenever possible. This wild factor of Sunbreaker Titan's grenades makes them extremely inconsistent, and even if you don't have a bad bounce on the grenade, you've still got a really thin area of effect. If enemies aren't staggered by the grenade's initial pulse, they're often going to step right out of it, and if they step around a corner or use cover effectively, then you've often just been screwed out of your entire grenade. For a game intended to be so casual friendly, not at all focused around perfect placement and timing of abilities, this feels really out of place. It's oftentimes really difficult to kill enemies who are not animation locked with this grenade, and if it's difficult to kill them with this grenade, then you're going to have trouble making sunspots, which is kind of the main reason to even play this subclass to begin with, which we'll talk about in great detail later, but just keep that in the back of your mind, that this grenade can be very inconsistent in creating the sunspots that we need to make this class shine. When you select the Code of the Siegebreaker skill tree, which is the bottom of the 2 skill trees, you're going to unlock a series of passives which allow you to generate sunspots on kills with your class abilities. Sunspots are these handy areas of spinning flame on the ground which deal damage over time to enemies that step inside and cause your abilities to recharge much more quickly as long as you stand inside them. By chaining grenade kills into sunspots, into more grenade kills, into more sunspots, you've suddenly got the ability to be self-sufficient and use grenades much more quickly than you would otherwise be able to. In fact, with the subclass exotic armor Hollowfire Heart active, a sunspot active, and 3 grenade cooldowns on your armor, you're looking at about 10 seconds to recharge your grenade, down from the normal 80 plus seconds, or Hollowfire Heart only's 26 seconds. No matter what other abilities in the game you compare this to, this is incredibly fast and gives you the potential to burn through adds and lock down choke points better than any other subclass in the game if we ignore supers. So from this perspective, there is value to this subclass. There is a reason to use it. Try slamming a thermite grenade down at an enemy spawn door alongside a rally barricade which is in their path as well, and laugh hysterically as your sunspot damage stacks on top of the thermite grenade and chains you into more and more thermite grenades. Try using this on the Glimmer Extraction public event, where the Fallen continually run in straight lines at you. They continually spawn out of dropships in these very predictable patterns, and you can very, very easily kill entire groups with a single grenade, create multiple sunspots to start boosting your cooldowns with, and you're able to steamroll through this entire public event by yourself thanks to sunspots and thanks to the thermite grenades. There is a lot of potential for these to be very powerful, but you need to use them in situations where enemies are going to be moving or behaving predictably, because if they're moving and behaving of their own free will, they're not animation locked, they're just going to run away from the grenade, take no damage to it, not die to it, you're not going to make a sunspot, and you're going to have issues. As you can see, there's upsides and downsides to these grenades. They've got crazy damage potential, but at the cost of versatility and reliability. With all this said though, is all of it really better than just playing Striker, slamming a pulse grenade in that same door or same choke point or same spawn area where they're getting out of a dropship, and then mopping up with whatever is left with a dash punch and getting that grenade charge right back again? Is it really better than that? Is it really comparable to that? I would say yes, it's comparable, but better? I don't know. I mean, it's about the same. Is it really that much more consistent than just pulse grenading? I don't know. In the case of raid bosses, fusion grenades are fine against Callus, but what about Argos? What against Savathun's Song? Your fusion grenades are just useless against those flying bosses, but your super does actually do something to the boss, unlike Strikers. So there is that trade, and it really depends on which of those two factors is more valuable to you. But even then, like, things are so comparable and the numbers are so big and so impossible to count while you're actually playing that are you really going to notice the difference anyways? The answer is probably not. The real selecting factor at this point should be, is your job to create orbs for your team because you're lacking hunters with Orpheus rigs? Or do you have hunters with Orpheus rigs and your job is going to be DPS by using the Sunbreaker Titan, or rather using the Hammer ult's ability? But at the same time, if that hunter is using Orpheus rigs, why aren't they just using Celestial Nighthawk and using the Goldie instead while you're using Striker? So really, it's like there is an optimal way of doing this and an optimal way of approaching these difficult raid boss level situations, and then using Sunbreaker Titan kind of flips it all on its head and reverses everything in a way that I don't think is like a way that you want to play high level content, but it's certainly not so bad that you shouldn't do it. It's just like maybe if the S tier strategy is having Celestial Nighthawks and Striker Titans to power them, then the A tier strategy would be the opposite way around, where the Titans are the damage and the Hunters are the orb generators. So it's not terrible by any means. It's not bad. It's actually pretty solid, but is it really comparable to that meta strat? I'm not really sure. Outside of super sweaty world's first prestige raid situations, though, it really doesn't matter all that much. If you're playing regular raid, if you're just playing public events and doing average stuff like heroic strikes, then really either of these two subclasses is going to do you just fine. Like, playing Sunbreaker is not going to be a big downgrade from playing Striker, despite what a lot of people would have you believe. It's really fine. Now, as you can see from the discussion that we've been having so far, basically what I'm saying is that Solar Titan's damage output, their killing potential, their survivability, and all that stuff is not particularly worse than Striker Titans. In fact, it's pretty competitive, but the main issue often comes with reliability, with ease of use, with ease of play, with just the general feel of the subclass. And that is very, very apparent when we look at the Sunbreaker's melee ability, of which I have a big problem with. Whenever you melee an ability, you're going to unleash an extra AoE damage once, and then that ability goes on cooldown. If you kill an enemy with this initial melee of the ability, you're going to generate a sunspot, which is great if you whiff on your grenade kills or your teammate steals the last hit from your grenade, something weird like that. This is your only other way of generating a sunspot. Now, that's all well and good, but the issue lies in the fact that your melee ability is consumed on your first melee attack. Whether or not it kills the target every melee attack that you make while having the ability ready to use will consume it, whether it gets the kill or not. This means that you have to first shoot any target that isn't a complete trash mob, and then punch them to finish them off. However, you don't want to get them too weak because then they risk dying from other random sources of damage, usually other teammates. You need to get them just low enough to die from one melee attack without randomly dying to other stuff, and then pray the auto-aim on your melee's lunge selects the target that you actually want it to select. There's nothing worse than getting an enemy weak, trying to melee them to make a sunspot, and then the game decides you wanted the dude to his left, and now you're left with a wasted melee ability and no sunspots. Frankly, this is incredibly annoying, and I wish the melee ability were only consumed on the actual melee kill, much like Warlock's Devour melee ability is only consumed on their melee kills. This would single-handedly fix a lot of the subclass's consistency problems and make it less of an onerous ordeal. Alternatively, Bungie could keep it so the AoE explosion still happens on that first melee, but applies a debuff to all opponents for a few seconds, and if they die from any source of damage while the debuff is active, they will then explode into a sunspot. Really, anything to make this interaction easier to use would be great. This subclass is too difficult and requires too much effort and thinking for an overly casual, bot-killing title like Destiny. One misstep, and the subclass misfires for 30 seconds, and that's really unfun. And if you don't have Hollowfire hard equipped or don't have a super ready, forget about it. Finally, we've got Titan's Barricade, which is actually, and surprisingly to me, unable to score kills no matter how hard you try, so it can't generate sunspots, and therefore we don't care about it any more than any other subclass does. The only exception to this is if you use the Kefri's Horn exotic. Kills with the line of thermite created by your barrier will in fact create a sunspot for some reason. Unfortunately, this thermite deals extremely low damage, and you're going to need to pre-injure even trash mobs with it while simultaneously bullying them into a corner and praying they don't move out of the way during your long casting time. It's just incredibly unreliable, and the exotic is straight up not worth using. At that point of min-maxing, I would strongly recommend you just run Mask of the Quiet One until your super is charged and then swap to Hollowfire Heart. If you're going to get that critical about things, I think that's the better way to go. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, your super, when using the Sunspot subclass, will generate a sunspot at your feet, but only if you're standing on the ground when activating it. If you're airborne, no sunspot for you, and you're gonna have to toss a hammer at your feet, then land in it to get the extra hammer tossing potential that this subclass provides, which honestly sucks, and yet again, removes agency from the player. Since the only real reason to use this subclass 9 times out of 10 is for the sunspot build, let's go into a little bit more depth on the mechanics of sunspots. Once created, they last about 4 seconds before disappearing if you don't use them at all. If you do step into one and then step back out, they only remain for about half as long as that before just straight up disappearing, even if it's before the full normal 15-second duration that they have. In general, sunspots feel really finicky, almost inconsistent at times. Rarely, when standing in a sunspot, you won't actually see the buff icon appear on the left side of your screen, despite the fact that you are, in fact, receiving the buff. There also seems to be some weirdness where if the enemy isn't standing completely on the ground, for whatever reason, if they die to your ability, they won't create a sunspot, and it's really hard to tell when it's going to happen, and quite frankly, you are not able to react to it or play around it in any way. Enemies can simply start floating or run over a ledge and kind of be airborne for just a split second, and suddenly, even though you should be making a sunspot, you're not sometimes, and it's really difficult to deal with. Occasional bugginess aside, I love the concept behind sunspots, but the execution simply falls flat. 4 seconds between killing an opponent with an ability and moving from wherever I am to where they died, usually out in the open where it's unsafe, is sometimes just not long enough for me to actually take advantage of that space. This is beside the fact that if you're killing enemies with thermite grenades, they're way out in the open, and that means if you use the sunspot, you are also out in the open and very exposed. For regular play, this is fine, but in any raid content where you have revive tokens, you're quite literally playing with fire, trying to use your sunspots maximally. What feels really unfortunate to me about this subclass is that while you're playing it, you're pigeonholed into using Hollowfire Heart as your exotic 100% of the time. You're forced to stand in the open to use your sunspots, so you'd think that Bungie would throw you a bone and give the armor that you're forced to use good stats like 2 resistance to recovery, right? Wrong. You get 2 mobility, 1 resistance, and 1 recovery. Gotta make sure that you have maximum jump height as a class that wants nothing more than to stand still on the ground. I'll concede that these stats have such a minor impact on gameplay that it's not that big of a deal anyways. It's the principle of the matter that irks me. It feels like the armor stats directly oppose what it's forcing you to do to take advantage of it maximally. While we're on the subject, let's talk more about the Hollowfire Heart, specifically its interaction with the Hammer of Soul Super. My main issue with it is that there's absolutely zero benefit if your super isn't charged at all. I'd love to see a small baseline increase to ability recharge for Sunbreaker Titans alongside its current benefits. It feels pretty terrible wearing exotic armor that doesn't actually do anything at all, while simultaneously having poor stats, but that's chump change compared to the rest of this class and doesn't at all contribute to the overall ickiness I feel when trying to force the subclass to work just by virtue of its mechanics. The Hollowfire Heart is disappointing because it does nothing while your super is not active and actively discourages you from using that super. If I'm being discouraged from using my super, why am I even playing Destiny to begin with? I want to throw hammers and explode things, but also have my grenades recharge faster than a minute and a half without having to rely on inconsistent at best sunspot generation techniques. And I don't want to have to rely on the other subclass, which literally does nothing until I use my super. It's like either I get good abilities without ever using my super, or rather I only get a good super without ever using my abilities. There's no like middle ground. I wish there was a third subclass where it's like you get a little better at your abilities and you get a little better at your super, and you can use either of them whenever you want. It's not about like trying to use all of one or all of the other, which is what the solar subclasses kind of pigeonhole you into at the moment. To say this all in another way, the sunspot mechanic dramatically changes the way you play, oftentimes to a fault. At its best, you're dynamically moving and leapfrogging enemies into new sunspots over and over and over, with health restoration from solar ability kills helping to sustain you. In reality, your teammates are going to steal your kills just by also happening to play the same video game as you are, while denying your solar ability kills, and therefore the fun of the subclass. Sunbreaker can be fun solo, since you're in complete control of which enemies die when and to what, but you have to play in such a specific and calculated way that you completely lose all the fun the moment you make one mistake. And by the time you're playing solo, and you're getting to high-level content solo, like maybe a solo Nightfall, this subclass is not viable for that. If you're not playing something like a Devour Warlock, you're kind of just wrong, because the Devour Warlock is just so good. So again, why are you playing this subclass? It's good for killing low-level, low-difficulty mobs, I guess, but when you're getting to high-level content, or when you're getting to end-game content, which is what people really want when they play this game 9 times out of 10, or at least so it seems, this subclass just feels a little subpar. It feels a little too difficult to pilot in order to get the same value that you could get out of a striker just mashing their grenade button and aiming at whatever they want, shooting whatever they want, moving how they want, doing what they want at all times, and not really caring because their abilities are so synergistic that they're going to get their cooldown reduction all the time without even really trying. With this subclass, you have to try so hard and focus so hard on your cooldowns that one mistake just feels so bad. Even though it's not, it doesn't really make a big difference anyways. It just feels terrible. To reiterate, Solar Titan is actually pretty good when it works, and is competitive enough with Striker in terms of damage and crowd control that I don't feel bad about using it most of the time. The problem is that it feels horrible to play the whole time you're using it. The potential end results with this class are comparable to what Striker Titan can accomplish, and I still like the Solar subclass despite the difficulty of use and the finickiness of the class, and I will use it as my main subclass even in raid content. The stuff it allows me to do when it goes off is straight up fun, and consistently one-phasing baths is just fantastic. All that I hope is that somewhere down the line, this subclass gets looked at and is made a bit easier to pilot so I can relax a bit more while playing it. Thanks for watching, everyone. If there's something burning you up about the Sunbreaker Titan that you want to talk about, let me know in the comments section down below. If you want to see more videos like this one, please consider supporting me over on Patreon so I can get away from my reliance on the inconsistency of YouTube advertisements and the demonetization bot. I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.